Well, joining me now, as you can see, author Sir Michael Morpurgo. His new book, Finding Alfie, a D-Day story, was inspired by true events and developed in partnership with the Royal British Legion. Sir Michael, good to see you on the UK Tonight, as always.
Thank you.
Your new book, not just based on true events, but events very personal to you and your family.
Yes, well, good evening. It's an honour to be here. Thank you for asking me. Yes, Finding Alfie really is a book which is from strange memory. I was born in 1943, which of course means I knew nothing about the war at all. It was going on around me when I was a little thing. I didn't know, but I did know a lot as I was growing up. I grew up in a pretty grey world. I played in bomb sites. There was a lot of depression around in families. There were a lot of families split up by it. You realise this thing had happened. This awful thing called war had happened. And actually, for a little kid, it wasn't so awful. You played games called war. You split into sides. There was us and the Germans. That was the sort of the way we looked at it. And until you got a little older and you discovered what had really happened. And very often it was a soldier you saw in the street. There was an old man who used to sit outside the sweet shop on my way to St. Matthias School. And he had a blazer and he had his medals there and he had a cap to put money in and a little Jack Russell dog, which I was terrified of. But I was terrified of something else too. I discovered one day that he only had one leg, that his trouser leg was folded over. And I didn't want to see that anymore. So I walked on the other side, both to avoid that absent leg and the dog. And I've never forgotten that war, what war does to flesh, what war does to buildings, what war does to families and societies, I saw growing up. So it made a huge, huge impression on me. And then when the British Legion came along and said, look, would you like to write a story which reflects this huge anniversary of D-Day, I had two reasons for doing it. One, which was really important, is my wife, Claire, had an extraordinary experience at age 8, going through a village in France called Trévière in Normandy. And she came into the square, and which is then, it was way back in the 50s, it was all battered, the buildings were still fallen down, everything was in a terrible state. And there was this statue by the church of a woman with her arm outstretched, it's a Victoire, it was like Joan of Arc. And then she noticed something dreadful, and that was that the whole of the face was missing. A shell had gone right through the face of this statue. She never forgot it. And we came to this village, and 60, 70 years later, drove into it. It's called Trévière. And she said, this is the place, this is the place. And we saw it. And the wonderful thing, and it's about hope, this is very important. The wonderful thing was that, yes, the statue was there. Yes, the hole in the face was there. But there was a bird's nest in the mouth of this extraordinary figure. And I thought to myself, that's hope. Life actually does go on. And I just think it's so important that in the middle of this, we remember that it does go on. People did survive. And the only other thing to say was that I once went to a cemetery and in Normandy again, I was about to do a talk in a library and I walked out into the countryside and I came to this graveyard cemetery of British soldiers. And about 30 years ago, I think, I just was walking around and I saw there was only one grave with flowers on it. So I went up and there was the flowers and a note. It was a paratrooper. It said age 19. And the note said, to Grandpa. And you're thinking to yourself, this is extraordinary. And all the names of the family, there are about 15, 20 names. So again, this man died and it was terrible. But life did go on. And they'd all come back to with respect and affection to see him.
So, Michael, that's interesting. You talk about the note there left to somebody's grandpa. I was talking to a veteran a few weeks ago. We played the interview out on the show last night, Ken Hay. He goes into schools to talk to children and he asks them to call him Grandad Ken because he says, you know, I am living history. Children now can't talk to their grandparents because they, weren't involved in the war. You know, it's people my age whose grandparents were involved in the war. And sadly, they are dwindling in number. They're not around us anymore. So it's through the D-Day veterans that are left, it's through works of fiction that children discover about World War I and World War II. And I know you're very passionate as children's laureate about that. I remember reading a book when I was at school called Carrie's War that taught me about the realities of World War II through the eyes of a child. So what is it we should be doing from this point on? Because, you know, we're talking about this being the last big event involving those veterans.
Yes, they'll all be gone. They'll all be gone. And what you say is so important. The fictional poetry has a huge part to play in this passing on what the story is. And the question, I suppose, and it's important, is what do you tell and what do you not tell to young children, which is really hard. And what we mustn't do, absolutely, is to traumatise them. But what we do have to do is to reflect the world in our stories as it was, and not as we would like it to be always. Otherwise, we just wrap every little book in a pink ribbon and say, that's fine, enjoy it, have a good laugh. Life isn't like that. And as children grow up, I don't think they want to be patronised. They want story writers like myself to look them in the eye and say, well, this is what I feel, this is what I care about. And you pass it on and let them deal with it, but do it in a way that is sensitive, but doesn't shy away from the loss, from the grief, and from the hope. It's very important in any story about war to have some sense of hope. So in Finding Alfie, the most important thing about this young man just left school and he's looking for someone he knows, his old auntie who's just died, and left him a picture, and the name of Alfie is on it, and the name of the place it's painted is Bradwell in Essex, and he just goes on a search, and he goes on a search looking who this Alfie is. And his story takes him to Normandy and takes him to a graveyard and takes him to a French family. And I wanted, particularly in this story, to reflect individual soldiers. The counting of numbers is difficult. If we start saying 300,000, it all goes into this blur. They were individuals. They were sons. They were fathers. They were mothers. All these people. And in France, what was really important to me, I discovered, as we all know, that massively they suffered in those places where the battles were fought. But their villages and towns became battlefields, and they died in their thousands in these towns in Normandy. So it's the connection also with us and the French people, and the fact that our people did go there and they did give their lives, what for? To drive away tyranny, to stop it coming to our shores, but also to give freedom to all these countries of Europe, and the first you come to is France. So yes, they were very grateful, but they suffered terribly, and they had suffered, of course, for 4 or 5 years, dreadfully.
And so, Michael, you make a really good point about it not being about the numbers, it being about individual stories. And of course, a lot of children find out about World War II through relatives, through tracing it back, through asking questions. And that should be encouraged by all of us going forward, whether, you know, granddad, great-granddad is around or not. Just finally, our time together is coming to a close. How will you be marking the D-Day anniversary tomorrow?
Well, I shall probably go for a long walk. I live in the middle of Devon, and I walk along the river called the River Torridge, very famous for an otter called Tarka. And I love just being in the countryside. And tomorrow, I think I shall be being thankful for the peace, which by and large I've lived through. I'm 80 years old, and the war after 2 years of my life has not come to this country again as a big war. We've had very unpleasant small wars, that's for sure. But by and large, we have learned to make friends with our enemies, to live with people, to collaborate, to cooperate, and to learn that. And then, of course, just recently, this is what's so important. We have had examples of countries invading other countries. And what do we see? We see the same thing. We see towns destroyed. We see women, children, old people lying in their ruins. It's the same thing all over again. And that I have to say, I am 80, but I will think on my walk tomorrow that actually we need to go back to that time when peace was important and friendship and forgiveness was uppermost in our minds, but not vengeance, not hatred. All those old men you talked to, it was so important to them that we didn't do this absurd thing again. You know, if human beings, that's all they've got to offer is to fight each other, we're not worth much. We're worth a lot more than that.
So, Michael Morpurgo, good to end on a note of hope, and thank you so much for joining us on the UK Tonight. Pleasure to talk to you as always. Thank you.